Welcome back. Let's Get Physical Therapy is an educational podcast brought to you by MedStar Health and hosted by me, physical therapist Becca Schumer. I will be sharing the mic with tons of healthcare professionals with the goal of educating and inspiring fellow PTs and future PTs. We hope you find this both informative and inspirational, ultimately optimizing how we treat our patients and grow as professionals. Please enjoy today's episode. Today on the podcast, we have physical therapist Robert Metzger. Robert's undergraduate degrees include a Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy and a Bachelor of Science in Exercise Physiology from Howard University. Robert has earned a doctoral degree in physical therapy from Emory University and has also completed a sports medicine residency at the University of Rochester. In 2015, Robert was chosen to be a Kevin Wilk Travel Fellow and studied sports medicine with national leaders in sports physical therapy at Stanford University, University of Wisconsin, and University of Cincinnati. He is recognized as a certified exercise physiologist with the ACSM. Robert has been researching primary ACL repairs. He's got his OCS, his SCS, and is also a faculty member for the MedStar Health Sports Physical Therapy Residency Program. Not only is Robert the clinic director of our Hyattsville Physical Therapy Clinic, he's also the co-chair of our Equitable Practice Interest Committee, aka EPIC. It was founded in 2020 with the mission of creating and maintaining a safe environment to bring awareness to, assess, and resolve barriers to equity, inclusion, and diversity for MedStar Health patients, staff, and community. Having this conversation about cultural competencies, identifying our own biases, understanding what DEI is in the healthcare field is of the utmost importance in society today. And so I'm really looking forward to having this conversation with Robert to learn more about it and how we can do better to optimize how we treat our patients, our colleagues, and really everyone in this world. Robert, welcome to the podcast today.
Hey, thank you for inviting me. I'm glad to be here and, just get an opportunity to discuss about you and some of the things that are going on in MedStar.
I think we've known each other for over 10 years now, so it's good to see a familiar face on the screen.
Yes.
We're going to talk about DEI today. I'm going to let you kind of get into that in a second, but first I want to hear about why physical therapy. How'd you get into PT?
Yeah, PT. I think it's a great resource, a great career choice and field to do a couple of things. I would say there's a two-pronged reason why I got into therapy. One is my mother, who utilized physical therapy heavily in her early 40s to 50s, which is probably more than a lot of people. She has had 4 knee replacements. So she's had 2 on each knee, and she started getting knee replacements when I was in high school. So I would go to physical therapy with her at times and see the process of, her getting mobile again. She worked in healthcare. She was a nurse, but she had relatively bad arthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, and that robbed her a little bit of her mobility. So the freedom that physical therapy was able to provide for her and the effort to get back to being mobile and living her life was something that I witnessed firsthand through her and through the physical therapists that interacted with her. So I really felt like that was one of the things. And then additionally is that I was an athlete growing up. I think you're always a little bit of an athlete, even as you get older. You still maintain that mindset, but you might not have that physical skill set. Just growing up and being involved in basketball, football, won the state championship. Our team won the state championship for high school and football for the state of Maryland. And you interact with a lot of people who have some nicks and bruises or potential injuries. And a great avenue to stay exposed, to keep in that team environment. It's hard to kind of recreate that team locker room environment. But being part of that staff, that physical therapy staff, athletic trainer staff, allows you to keep that same type or similar camaraderie. So even if you're not playing in the field, you can still be on the field and in the team setting. So I think those were the 2 main things that kind of drove me towards the physical therapy field.
And you are a brainiac, sir. You have your OCS, your SCS. We have some new grads that are hopefully going to be listening to this, or PT students. How would you suggest either getting into one, both? Kind of how did you go that route? And you also do research.
I just think that being a professional in your field and being passionate. My goal was to be great at what you do. And there's a lot. I'm into music, and there's an artist that says top five dead or alive, and I just really like took that to heart. I just really wanted to be one of the top people in my field, and I think one of the things that we as human beings is we get comfortable. So maybe about 3, 4 years in, you get a certain amount of a skill set, you understand your patients a little bit, and you need new challenges. If it doesn't challenge you, it doesn't change you. So as you're going through this process, you kind of realize, well, what is the next chapter? What is the next challenge? So um, did a sports residency, and that was a good challenge, and it was allowed me to grow, allowed me to see surgeries. It's allowed me to become more proficient in my field, become an expert. Because sometimes you do things, but you don't understand the reason why. You're not confident. You know you're supposed to do this, but really understanding time frames, muscle healing, tissue properties. The second part was the OCS was a team challenge. So basically, and that goes back to being in an athletic environment, a locker room setting, is how can we share team goals? How can we have a shared vision? And one of the shared visions that I casted out for the team is that, hey, I want to be the only site in the network to have every therapist board certified. So every member of our team took the OCS. We all passed, and it was just one of those other things that it pushed each other to be great. It's not something where we're just relying on ourselves, and then we're able to interact. Hey, what do you think? What do you think? And we're getting into an environment where we are actively engaging not only our therapist, we're actively engaging our patients, we're actively engaging our community, and just trying to be better. So that was kind of how we did with the OCS. Did a couple other things. It's good to get involved in the community and other aspects, and just apply. I think sometimes before people tell us no, we tell ourselves no. And I think we need to get out the habit of saying, hey, let someone tell me that I'm not good enough to do that. Let somebody tell me that I cannot achieve that. And the only way to do that is by putting your name in the hat, going out there, doing the best that you can. No one ever regrets doing their best. And I just try to live my motto, and I tell my patients, you might regret not doing your best. You definitely won't regret working your hardest and achieving or doing whatever happens. So
This is a great time to segue into our topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion, because we can grow ourselves as clinicians, learn how to treat injuries better, and all of that. But we also need to address this other side of understanding our own biases. And, in the clinic, we're going to encounter people of all genders, races, sex, religion, ability status. We're going to encounter a lot of these things. And so I want to get into just kind of defining what is DEI. I know different organizations sometimes switch the letters. I know sometimes letters are added, like A for accountability, S for stewardship. So there's a lot of different variations, but tell me a little bit about what MedStar Health does and how you got involved in that.
DEI would be diversity, equity, and inclusion. A lot of organizations structure programs around that. You might hear that on a national basis. And that's a pretty common term. MedStar took a little twist on that. They wanted to go equity first, equity, inclusion, and diversity. Diversity is important, but one of the things that MedStar said, diversity for diversity's sake doesn't really necessarily add. And we want to make sure that we're equitable, and that means giving everybody what they need to be successful. And I think sometimes we lack a clear understanding of that, because what you may need for success may be different from what I may need for success. And when you're living in an equitable society, equitable organization, we understand that we all come in with different needs, different requirements. And as we move forward to create an even playing field, or as even playing field as possible, it's never going to be 100% even, but we want to make sure that we are giving our colleagues, our coworkers, our employees the tools to be successful. EID is an environment to try to best meet the needs of the MedStar community. And that ranges from patients to clinicians to senior leadership. And I think that it's something that's been progressing over time, but I think something that really stirred or lit a fire was the year 2020. There was a lot of civil unrest in this country. It centered around a lot of things. I think some of it was some of the frustration of the pandemic, but also I think some of the clear inequities that were brought out from the George Floyd incident, where a person who was already detained ended up losing their life. And we started asking ourselves questions. We started soul searching as a community, as a nation. How can we make this better? So I think that was one of the main push for a lot of organizations to say, hey, we're looking to make this world a better place.
I want to take a little step back and define these terms. And I brought up the definitions from the EPIC website just to bring a little more clarity to what equity is, inclusion, and diversity, just, so it's clear. So I'm going to read this for a second and we can go back to talking. Equity is ensuring fair treatment, equality of opportunity, and fairness in access to information and resources for all, reflects organizational values built on respect, integrity, and dignity for all, the fair and equitable treatment for all people, including access to opportunities and services. Equity recognizes that advantages and barriers exist, and as a result, we all don't start from the same place. Inclusion is a culture and climate of belonging that actively invites the contribution and participation of all people. People are valued, respected, accepted, heard, and encouraged to fully participate. And then diversity is the representation of all our varied identities and differences. These can be along the dimensions of race, ethnicity, gender identity or expression, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, age, physical and mental abilities, veteran status, religious beliefs, political beliefs, or other ideologies. With that said, how, as a profession, are we moving forward to ensure that this is on our minds? Because I know when I was in PT school, this was not taught.
Yeah, every location is different, right? Treating in rural Kansas or Georgia is going to be different from treating in an urban setting like New York City or Washington, D.C. But as a country as a whole, particularly the United States, we are a multicultural, multi-diversity nation that is enshrined in the DNA of this country. So I think there's two particular ways that you can look at this as far as EID. EID in regards to the patient population that you may see, but EID also in regards of the clinical treating demographics. So traditionally, there's been, and still to this day, there's more women in physical therapy than men. Traditionally, there are less minorities in physical therapy than the normal patient population. So one of the calls for is for the profession to reflect some of the diversity in the patients that they see. And I think one of the things to help promote awareness is, hey, sometimes if you don't know, you don't know. How do I there is a human interaction that's innate in all the things that we do, but there's certain cultural differences that we just may not be aware of, certain regional differences, certain ethnic differences that we are not aware of. And how can we make both the clinicians more aware of the diversity of our patients, and then also um, making sure that the clinicians look as diverse, or not as diverse, but more diverse to reflect the patient population that they're treating. So that can be gender identity, that could be gender, that could be race, that could be ethnicity. But a lot of times, some people just may be more comfortable. If you're a female, you might feel more comfortable with a female. If your gender identity is different, or if your gender is different, or your orientation, you may be more comfortable with different clinicians who may understand certain aspects. So we want to attack that from a tool from both ends of the spectrum to adequately meet some of those needs.
Those are great identifiers and how we can be better as clinicians to not just increase the diversity within our clinics amongst practitioners, but also seeing diverse patient populations. I also want to make sure we address our own implicit biases, because if we don't identify what those are and kind of take a look in the mirror and make sure we're not ourselves being biased in whatever way. What
Yeah.
I think I lost my question here, but yeah, I think like I know with renewing our license now in Maryland, we have to, and I'm assuming it's across the board, but we have to take an implicit bias course, which is just a simple one-off course, and there's a lot of ways that you can do that. But again, like, can you talk to the importance of looking within ourselves and understanding ourselves and how that impacts EID?
Yeah. So bias is the lens in which we see the world. And the thing about bias is that we oftentimes are not aware of our own innate biases unless we see that in contrast to something else. Just for example, for growing up in a two-parent household, you might assume that a two-parent household is the way that everybody grows up in the world. But there are many people who don't grow up in a two-parent household, and the way in which they look at the world will be different. And you may not even recognize that unless you talk or interact with somebody who didn't grow up in those in that situation. So one of the things about bias is being aware to openly investigate other people's perceptions, but also being more aware of your own perceptions of the world. And it doesn't mean that it's bad. So I think a lot of times people say, "Oh, I have a bias." Yeah, you have a bias. Everybody has biases. Everybody has preferences. Um, if I have a bias for vanilla or strawberry, then I may not get chocolate, but it doesn't mean that chocolate is bad. It just means that I'd have an internal bias within myself to have certain things. But if I'm aware of it, then maybe instead of always bringing in strawberry or always bringing in something else, I can say, hey, you know what? Somebody might like chocolate ice cream or chocolate cake. And I could say, you know what? I'm bringing in something for the staff that has chocolate or could have vanilla or either or. So I think that in a clinical aspect, those things arise as well. It may not be as subtle. Sometimes things are very subtle, and sometimes things are more sensitive. But I think the way that you address sensitivity is not running away from it. I think a lot of times in this, we've created a culture and we've created environments that we can't explore, we can't understand each other if we're not talking to each other. So I think EID is one of the areas where we try to create safe spaces to ensure that other people's voices are heard and respected so that we can find a common path forward to make sure that everybody has access to opportunities to be the best versions of themselves. And that's not all, and not everybody feels that way. Some people don't feel like they have the access, the opportunity, the platform, the services to allow them to flourish or be the best versions of themselves. And if you feel like you don't have resources or outlets to disclose those frustrations, then it can be very challenging. And another person could be totally unaware. I think that what MedStar is doing here in creating EID, and not only creating it, because sometimes people create things just to check the box, but empowering the organization and empowering this section to make actionable changes within the entire network as a whole is empowering and uplifting certain voices that may have felt marginalized prior to this.
Another bias that exists is confirmation bias. So, say on social media, I am used to seeing people do CrossFit. So, CrossFit body is a certain body, and I never see larger bodies or smaller bodies or less fit bodies. So, all I'm confirming is this is the one body that exists. And I think it's important in that scenario to open up our eyes and look for other things, because if we're always fed the same thing, then we're just confirming what we already know, what we think to be true. That's just one example of challenging our own biases and looking for the opposite of what we think. What are some other resources or tools or that clinicians can use to better understand our biases and practice that in the clinic?
I think that's a great question. I think that having genuine check-ins, and I think regardless of where you are within an organization, you should have regular check-ins. You get regular check-ins with every organization is different. So it's hard to say with each organization. With our organization, we do have several resources available within MedStar through not only programs like Epic, but through our mental health, through our we have like an internal education tool like Percipio, where you can look up different emotional IQ, different interaction skills, how to build um, higher therapeutic alliance with patients. But I think the greater goal within organizations that may be big, like MedStar organizations with maybe smaller, is to really have regular check-ins with people who are at the same level as you, but people that are also in higher positions. And if you're in a higher position, people that are in lower positions, and ask them, hey, what are areas that I can do better at? And take that with a genuine level of curiosity. Hey, is there an area that, hey, that, you know, have I been interacting well with patients? Have there been any feedback? What type of and I think if you create these open spaces to talk, and you're not going to be able to talk openly with everybody, and that's not the goal, but it's to try to find at least somebody within the organization that you feel that you can have some liberty to create an open space to talk with, so that you can have that moment where you call reflection and practice. And if you're reflecting upon some of the things that you're doing, reflecting upon some of the interactions that you're having with patients, I think you'll get a greater awareness and understanding of what biases or what interactions or how you may be creating certain scenarios with your actions.
That's a great example of having open communication, because if we're never talking about these things and we're internalizing them, then, we're never going to work on improving our biases. And there's a lot of shame, I think, in admitting these things within yourself. So having someone that you can have those open conversations with is crucial. I think another great way to improve our DEI, EID is to spend time in other places. So I
That's
work at a clinic up in Hunt Valley at USA Lacrosse, and I see a certain population. So if that's all I see, that's all I know. So going down to DC or other clinics in Baltimore City and getting different patient populations, I think that's another valuable tool that clinicians can use.
Yeah, expanding your horizons, expanding your interactions. I floated around as a therapist for a while, and diversity of thought, diversity of ideas is a great thing. So the therapist I am today is amalgamation of many therapists that came before me. So even with like the skill sets that I use, I say, you know what, I like the way that that therapist interacts or does that one thing. I'm gonna borrow that. I like the way, and then over time, you borrow these ideas and you create your own entity of who you want to be. And that's the same thing that you do with patients, like how they interact. How do you interact with that? You can borrow exercise, but you can also borrow the way in which people ask certain questions or the way that they say certain phrases to kind of like calm down a situation or allow somebody to feel supported. So, and then as you work with different patient populations, you'll kind of understand what do they value. And I think sometimes that's the biggest challenge. We unconsciously expect other people's values to be the same as our values, and that's not always the case. So when we impose our values onto another group of people's values without asking or without knowing, then that's when people feel marginalized. But once you're interacting with different groups of people, that you understand that, hey, their values, their desires, their wants may be different, then you can understand and respect that, and give them a natural space to grow.
As a clinic director, and I'm sure you've, as you said, you've been in a lot of different clinics, when you identify a biases or something, an interaction going on that doesn't maintain these standards, how do you coach an individual?
That's a great question. I think that, I mean, everybody's different, but I assume most people that get in therapy are naturally good people. They want to help people out. They are doing it for altruistic reasons. They don't have a mean spirited nature to them. I think a lot of times what happens is that the communication may be lacking, the empathy may be lacking in certain situations, and the just what the person values may be lacking. So most of the time when you're in healthcare situations and there's some discrepancy, it's most about how they presumed the other person felt about them, or how they presumed that they were treated, while the other party is could have no clue that that's going on. So I think when you have those interactions, it's just making sure that people say, hey, can you put your hat on in a different scenario, in a different position? And is it possible that somebody could feel this way with this type of scenario? And create those possibilities, create those circumstances in people's mind to say, hey, I can see that. I can see the possibility, and I'm willing to grow from that. And I think when you're in those type of scenarios where you say, hey, I see a challenge, I see an obstacle, but I also can see a solution. So as a manager, as a director, your goal is not merely to say this is the problem. It's not to identify deficits. It's to show you areas of growth and support you in overcoming them. So I think if you merely show people's deficits, they can become jaded or lost. You have to assist them or support them in overcoming obstacles.
Let's talk about clinician to patient. And something that you were kind of getting at was we can't be a mind reader. We don't know what the other person in front of us is presenting with. So I think it's important to ask a lot of questions, ask pronouns, ask permission to touch someone. You never know someone's history and, where they're coming from. So again, we can't be mind readers. So from a clinician to patient perspective, and kind of going back to PT school and that ICF model and understanding the personal factors that the patient brings to the table, how can we be better as clinicians?
That's a great question. Like, honestly, I don't think we were trained on in our current generation, but I can see it in younger generations. Like even in Disney movies, they are so like, just the asking permission to touch. Hey, can I do this? Or are you comfortable? And some of that, some people say, well, that's just, you should just know that. But you don't, how do you know something if you were never taught it? I think creating an environment for a patient to heal is creating an environment where they're comfortable. It's hard to get healing without comfort, in the sense that they're comfortable enough to trust you, that you have their best interest in heart. Not in the sense that comfort, that you can't grow without comfort. Because, obviously when you come to therapy, you're going to have some trying and challenging situations. But they have the positive, and this is, you want to build up that trust, and you keep on depositing the trust into the therapist so that they feel they trust you enough to say, even though I know this hurts, I have deposited so much trust in you that it doesn't bother me that I'm experiencing this pain. So when you interact with patients, I think that it is good training, whether if you know them or if you don't know them, is just to ask them simple things, regardless. Hey, how would you like me to refer to you? Some people have different names that they prefer. Not, would you like me to call you Miss? Would you like me to call you by your first name? What are any challenges that you've had previously in therapy? I always like to ask that. If you've had therapy before, what are some challenges? Because then it gives you a starting point to say, hey, they already have a certain value system around these activities. I need to be aware of that. So I always ask them, have you had therapy before? If you had therapy, what were your challenges? What went well? So if you identify areas to say, hey, this is what to be careful about, and these are areas in which they thought were able to be productive, then you can grow and create and cultivate a system based off of your own best practices, based off of evidence, based off of your feel of the patient, and construct a program that meets their needs, not only from a physical aspect, but from a social, economic, and personal aspect as well.
Creating a safe environment for our patients is critical. And every time you enter a passage, you get into the zone. So when I enter the PT clinic, everything I believe about myself or whatever, my values, I mean, obviously they're within me, but my biases need to be checked at the door so that every patient that comes in, it's a blank slate. I don't have assumptions about any of that. I just take them for the person in front of me and ask a lot of questions and just try to dive in and get a better understanding of where they're coming from. Because I think if we don't do that, then we're doing our patient a disservice. And again, it's easy to address the orthopedic issue in front of us, but if you don't take into account the whole human, we're missing the boat.
And you got biases even with the evidence, right?
Sure.
So I know sometimes I look at the chart and I'm like, man, this person's a train wreck. And I come in and they look okay. And I'm just like, well, what I perceived from reading the chart is different. And what I actually see is different. So you have to keep your eyes open for multiple viewpoints, like you said, and just try to see where they're at and then treat them for who they are. Because sometimes you can get led astray a little bit, even with other people's ideas, perceptions, or your own. So
Get a little personal here. I know back when I was a clinician earlier in my treating days, I had a patient who was deaf, and they didn't want an interpreter. They didn't want someone doing sign language for them. As a new clinician, I'm like, how am I going to do this? Like, how am I going to navigate this and give them optimal care? But I just kind of like went with it. I got a clipboard. We drew a lot of pictures, wrote a lot of things down, and just by demonstrating, I think that just goes to the fact that we have to be extremely adaptable and meet the needs of our patients. And I'm wondering if you can share any challenging stories you've had or encountered as a clinician and how you had to navigate that situation.
yeah, I mean, I think I'm thinking about a certain situation recently where I had somebody who was hard of hearing or deaf, and you have a certain deaf culture, and just like heavy culture in a lot of different areas, a subsegment of society. And steps is very small, but something that I kind of picked up. They had an interpreter, but something as simple to me is picking up their hand and placing it onto like a handle for a UBE. I thought there was nothing wrong with it. And then the interpreter said, do not do that. They said you need to guide. So what I realized is that I guess people don't like to be shoved or moved. What they prefer is that you put their hand on you and then you will guide them to the handle. So you're not like grabbing them and pushing them onto something. You're letting them flow with you in the process to obtain a certain object. And it's a subtle difference, but it makes a large impact in the way in which they perceive the world and the way that they perceive their interaction with you. And it's something really, really small that I would have never have guessed unless I actually went through. And sometimes you just go through those interactions and it's just there's no way to know until you know. You know, like how am I supposed to be 100% caught up in any specific culture and something that I don't live in and live out on a daily basis? You know, if somebody is deaf, their experience as deaf is something that they live in day in, day out. It's not something that they can just put on and take off. Obviously, you're just going to learn in that experience and then just keep it as something, as a mental check note for other patients into the future.
What you alluded to earlier, kind of picking up different ways clinicians treat people, but also those little nuggets that our patients teach us so much on how to help other people too. I love it. What are some resources that people can access more about EID?
That is a great question.
I know the APTA has a great section on it. It's one place. Anywhere else?
It depends, you know, because even like on a state level, there's different areas that focus to that. It's kind of like one of those scenarios where I don't know if there is I'm sure there's like diversity organization groups, but it's not like in the sense that there's one national organization that encompasses, because there's so many diverse issues. So you can go from,
Is there like a quiz that someone can take to learn more about their own biases and then kind of go from there?
there's a lot of different like quizzes and personality types. And I think that will tell you a little bit more about your different. So there's like Myers-Briggs and other things to tell you like the way in which you interact with people. I think those are like those personality type. And I think they would tell you like, hey, what do you prefer? How do you best interact? How do you best communicate? I think you have a lot of resources to determine that. I do think there are different biases in the way that you're interacting with, or certain preferences. And I think there's a lot of like what you call communication drill, communication articles that kind of encompass some of that. That was a good question.
I think maybe a good place to start is for a clinician looking to learn more about it is to just take some time maybe and journal and write down some thoughts that they have on the topic and see if they can identify any of these variables that might be influencing how we're treating ourselves and our patients.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, I would love to say, hey, these are the top 5 organizations on DEI, or I mean, but there's so many things like, you can have ACLU, there's different organizations that talk about different areas of biases. So you might have certain things that talk about gender biases. You might have certain organizations that talk about race biases. You might have certain organizations that talk about religious biases. But I'm not sure if there's one organization that talk about all different, type of biases specifically. So
that's totally fair. And again, I think that's why identifying our own and maybe starting there, picking one more general area that we can learn more about would be helpful to start.
yeah.
Great. This has been an amazing conversation. Did we miss anything? Is there anything else you want to cover on the topic?
I would just say that for whatever organization that you are in, I would also reach out to your HR and just ask them what tools do they have available for your organization, for your entity to help with that. Because some of the work has been laid out and some of the work has been done. And the challenge is that it just hasn't been disseminated to large components of the working body or in employment. Reach out to HR, ask them about any tools or services that are available for your specific organization. And then once you start to get a couple, you can always look at the references and start to build out your own that kind of help you feel more comfortable. And then beyond that is that if you are uncomfortable about a situation or you're uncomfortable, sometimes the best thing is like how just have a conversation, even like certain things with my own children as they start to interact with people. It's like, hey, start to have those conversations, like, around your family, around your household. I was like, if they see somebody who's may have a disability or whatnot, and just, well, they're in a wheelchair. And then it's like, well, why are they in a wheelchair? And they might ask. I was like, well, they don't have the opportunity to use their legs. But the more they're exposed to it, the more they have those interactions, it's not something that is foreign to them. And when you have those foreign interactions, that's when you have a breakdown in communication, a breakdown in awareness or understanding. So just promoting honest and open conversation in safe manners. And if you don't know, then you don't know. Then you just go and look for the answers.
Fantastic. I appreciate this conversation, Robert. I like to end each episode asking your favorite quote. What is a quote that moves you, drives you, doesn't have to be PT related?
All right, I got two. I got one that I give to my patients, and then one that I kind of just live by. The one that I kind of hit my patients with a lot is practice does not make perfect, it makes permanent. So a lot of times people go home and they practice and practice and practice. But if you're practicing doing something the wrong way, you are driving and creating those factors to become permanent. So you don't want to necessarily just practice something, you want to do it the right way. And then on a slightly more religious basis for me is one from the Bible. My grace is sufficient. My power is made perfect in your weakness. And sometimes I feel like it's okay to be vulnerable. I feel like every time we are in a culture that always promotes having all the answers, being super strong, and sometimes just relying and understanding that, sometimes your weakness allows other people to be strong. It allows your faith to grow and your faith to become stronger. And that entails makes you a better, more whole, more engaging person. So if we were always right, if we were always perfect, if we were always infallible, there would be no growth. So as humans and as people, we're looking to be better people, better brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, cousins. So we look for our growth, and we only get there through our imperfections, and we learn from them and we move forward.
Part of the reason I always ask everyone their story and how they got to where they are. I love hearing people's stories and the different backgrounds that all got us to the same profession, right? So I think just continuing to be a sponge and take it all in and just open our eyes wide to all the diversities that exist in this world and make us unique. It's pretty cool.
All right. Well, thank you.
Yep. Where can people find you, Robert?
They can find actually I have a podcast. It's totally different. It's just on family and faith. It's Family Abide, and on the MedStar website. My name is Robert Metzger. And I'm a physical therapist and clinic director here at Hyattsville.
Thank you, Robert.
All right now.
Thanks for listening to the Let's Get Physical Therapy podcast. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast and follow us on Instagram at MedStar Health PT. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please give us a 5-star rating and leave a review so we can reach more listeners just like you. As always, we appreciate your time and hope you join us for our next episode.